You're listening to Lighthouse Conversations, brought to you by Lighthouse Haven, a spiritual home for your awakening soul. Lighthouse Conversations is a show where awakening souls gather to be inspired, connected, and enlightened. Spiritual spark plug and host Chelly Canales, that's me, will guide you through the twists and turns of your journey to a safe haven where you are finally free to live your best light. Each episode contains a conversation with a guest who has gone through a spiritual awakening, detailing their unique and life-changing experiences in an intimate and candid way. Although everyone's experience is as unique as they are, we all share one common thread. We're all seeking something. So, come join us on this journey and be prepared to leave with resources that will supercharge you into inspired action. Here's today's episode. Hello, awakening souls. How are you doing during this time? I know that we've been in isolation for a while here, but how many of you have noticed that during this time your dreams have become more vivid, your intuition is lit, suddenly you're getting all these downloads and insights and these wounds are coming up for healing, and suddenly you're just finding new ways of thinking about them or feeling into them. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like I've heard some other people talk about it as well. We definitely talk about it in today's interview. Danielle Dulsky is an incredible author. She has this beautiful new book, Seasons of Moon and Flame, which focuses on the hag archetype in the witchcraft world. And so I'm fairly new to learning about this subject, and I really appreciated her taking the time to break down what witchcraft means to her, why it has a stigma attached to it, and what it actually is versus, of course, the common myths that come along with it. So I think you'll find this really incredibly interesting, and she's just delightful. So here's a great chance to maybe sit down and learn something about something you may have thought differently about in the past, or maybe this further confirms how you're feeling right now and gives you a sense of community and being at home. Either way, take a listen. I'm so glad you're with me. And welcome to the show, Danielle. How are you doing?
Very well, Shelly. How are you?
Doing well. I hear there's a storm a brewing where you're talking to me from today. How's the energy and the weather going on over there?
I love pre-storm energy. So it's really great. Nothing's really happening yet except the trees are sort of bending backwards. So that's sort of electric time.
Yes. Oh, that's very powerful. I'm so excited to talk to you about your new book, Seasons of Moon and Flame, The Wild Dreamer's Epic Journey of Becoming, which is like no book I've ever read before. So I'm really thrilled to talk to you about it. But I want to go back through your journey. You are a speaker, an author, an activist, a witch, a writer. You're a storyteller, and that's foremost in everything you do. You guide people through their own journeys, through this very, rich life that you have. Have you always felt like this was your calling, or did this happen over time? Were there any specific incidents that kind of led you down this path? Can you remember how it all happened?
Yeah, I always wish there was some really big epic moment that I could describe as like the initiation of my journey. I don't really have one. I have a few kind of like I would call them seed memories, or like these moments where I know that something was happening or something was watching me.
Yes.
Um, so when I was around, well, when I was 18, it was right after I graduated high school, I took off and moved to Ireland for 6 months.
Mm.
And it was the first time where I felt this connection between my witchcraft, even though that wasn't the word that I was using for it at the time. I was
Hmm.
still afraid of that word at the time,
Sure.
but I was very much practicing witchcraft in hindsight. And so it was the first time where I felt that was rooted in something very ancestral for me. So I had a few moments when I was over there where I was definitely saved by some sort of force, whether it was a great great grandmother that was still there protecting me or something. I'm not sure, but there were moments where I felt very much held by what I would call the other world. So that was sort of the real beginning of my of my work. And then when I was 25, I had my first son, and I did have this, what I would call an epic moment, where it was sort of a dark night of the soul time, when you're
Mhm.
like nursing your baby and you feel just totally alone in the
Yeah.
world, and it's like 3 a.m. Um, and I had this thought where I wanted him to grow up and be as authentic as possible and not have to hide any huge part of who he was. And yet I was still very much
Oh,
hiding a huge part of who I was. And I was living in a very conservative part of the
sure.
country. And so it wasn't where I grew up, but I had moved to this very conservative part of the country. And I was hiding it. And I decided that it was kind of hypocritical of me to, to be hiding this huge part of who I was if I didn't want him to have to do that. So that was a moment when I wasn't going to go to the rooftops and start screaming that I was a witch, but I decided that I wasn't going to actively cover it up anymore. So that was a huge moment in my journey. And then after that, I had another baby, and I went through this, the Saturn return time, where
Mhm.
everything kind of falls apart and comes back together again a few
Yeah, I'm
years
there
later.
now. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Well, welcome.
Thank you. It's very fruitful, or it will be. It will be.
It will be, yes. So I moved back to where I'm from, which is outside of Philadelphia, and had gotten divorced, and was saying, like, I'm never going to be out there as a witch again, because it was a huge part of my wounding. It was actually one
Yeah.
of my elder teachers who ended up kind of being the catalyst for my entire family falling apart. So it
Hmm.
was like my witchcraft was sort of tied in with this great wounding of my life. And I decided that, like, I didn't blame witchcraft, but I wasn't going to be out there anymore because it
Mhm.
didn't feel safe. And that lasted about 5 minutes. And then I was, within a couple of years, I was teaching and leading covens in the community. And then, of course, started writing books and became more out there than I've ever been
It's
after deciding I
incredible.
wasn't going to. Yeah.
Isn't that
Yeah.
amazing how that happens? I hear a lot about the witch wound, of that
Hmm.
many people who are stepping into their, or stepping into using their voice as a teacher of some sort, whether it's spirituality or witchcraft or different things that are not uh, what people talk about in normal day to day society, right? That people are afraid
Hmm.
of, that people are scared to step into it. But then something happens, you're activated, and all of a sudden your voice gets so big and so loud that you're calling in all of the other souls that are ready to step into it as well. So it's a
Hmm.
ripple effect. It's a beautiful thing. I want to talk about the word witch. There's such a stigma attached to it, and for me it's very funny because I was working on doing like a sister circle of sorts, but not, I mean, I didn't call myself a witch at all. That word was scary to
Hmm.
me. And a friend of mine who was putting in, we're going to do a moon ceremony and all this, she put the copy out there saying, and now our white witches, and she said my name, and I freaked out. I said, how can you call me a witch? Against, you didn't ask me if that's okay. I don't know if that's what I am. I'm probably not that. And so this fear came in. It just like someone was
Yeah.
trying to kill me.
Right.
And so I want to talk about that experience of that, from like a cultural perspective, if you have, any insight on that and what it meant for you specifically to heal that.
Hmm. Yeah. I've been talking a lot with my students about the witch wound, and I don't know why exactly these peculiar corona times are stirring that up for
Mm-hmm.
people, but
Mm-hmm.
it really seems like it is. There's some sort of connection between maybe the collective anxiety and fear, and it just tapping into this old feeling of being hunted,
Yes.
or it not being safe to be intuitive. And I know that, like, a lot of people, it's unfortunate because a lot of people, their intuition is just lit right now, like
Oh,
it's on
yes.
fire, the dreams that people are having, and they're just
Mm.
so kind of like in this time of great uncertainty, like never more certain about certain parts of their life, particular parts of their life, but and yet having to hide it because of this fear that's being stirred
Yeah.
up about, like, well, don't tell people that you know that, or so I don't really know why it is, but yeah, it is in there. I think that we all we all have a cellular memory of the burning times.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I study it, and the more my students study like the actual data and the actual evidence, because I also think there's a block to that sometimes. There's like, we know about it, but we don't really want to learn about it
Sure.
kind of thing, because
Sure.
it's not pleasant. But the more that you read about it and see the numbers and the kind of horrific details, the more you realize, well, like, of course that's still in the residual memory.
Yeah.
That's of course that's still, running around in the collective unconscious. Um so yeah, that's it's there. I think that what I tell my newer witches is that the more proof you have that you can tell people that you're, doing a full moon ritual, or whatever it is you're doing, the more proof that you have that you won't be completely rejected or betrayed or abandoned when you do that,
Mm-hmm.
the more courageous you get about being out there with your witchcraft. And yet it's also a very personal choice. So there's witches that kind of stay, in the broom closet their entire lives, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You don't
The
have to
broom
be out
closet.
there, yeah, in the broom closet. um so it doesn't have to be a huge part of your witch's story that you are like out in public as a witch. I don't think that that's
Sure.
necessarily true, but the fear is real, and the more proof that you get that you aren't going to be tied to the stake in this
Mm-hmm.
life,
Mm-hmm.
the more likely you are to just keep taking it steps farther. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people in society, I think if you ask them, do you, feel a connection with nature? Do you understand something about the cycles of the moon? Do you feel like your intuition is your strongest ally? Do you, if you ask them certain things, be like, well, yeah, yeah, of course. And
Mhm.
to me, that's kind of along the definition of what a witch might be versus what society tells you in order to make you scared of it, which is, you look at Halloween and all of these like costumes that are meant to make you be repelled and whatnot.
Mhm.
So what would you say, like, what is true about what being a witch means, and what is like some kind of societal construct put upon it so that people don't trust themselves, if you will, and their own knowingness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that, any witch would give you a different answer about
Hmm.
what a witch is, or what being a witch means. But for me, it is anybody who, first of all, has claimed the name witch for themselves. So
Mm.
if you haven't owned the fact that you're a witch yourself, then nobody should really be calling you a witch. It's not up to anybody else. Um, so you've claimed the name witch for yourself, and then you practice witchcraft, and that can mean drastically different things to different people. So for many witches, witchcraft is a religion,
Hmm.
and for many others, witchcraft is more of an art. And for some people, it's both. And as far as what the distinction is, I don't feel like I should be the one to say exactly what the distinction
Sure.
is. For me, my witchcraft is very much an art, and yet I do work with deity, and so there are
Hmm.
components of it that other people might say, well, that's a religion. But for me, religions are more systemic than I
Hmm.
view my witchcraft. So I don't really love rules very much,
Yeah.
especially with my spiritual practice. So with a religion, I feel as though there might be external rules or boundaries placed upon me. And I think that if it's truly a feminist religion or a feminist spiritual practice, then nobody else can really tell you exactly how to do it. It's
Sure.
all about autonomy and your choice. So yeah.
That makes total sense when you think about, the patriarchal religions and how you must be this or else you don't fit. That's kind
Right.
of what this is not necessarily rebelling against, but it's if there's a rejection of those systems, there's got to be a space where you can say, I'm not going to go to another system that's going to put specific boundaries on me and say, I'm not in it anymore,
Exactly.
because then I'm still in it. Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. And there's
Ooh,
always going to be gatekeepers that are telling you
yes,
that you're doing it
always,
wrong, no matter what you're
always.
doing. So yeah.
Well, I want to talk about the book. So you have 3 books, it seems like. Is it a series where you go through the different archetypes? Because in this one, you specifically focus on the hag, which I really want to dive into. Tell me a little bit about the journey and the progression of the books to taking you to this book where you honor and celebrate the hag archetype.
Yeah. So my first book, Woman Most Wild, I wrote that in 2016 and it came out in 2017. And that was sort of my first go at trying to explain witchcraft as like in terms of different components, like different things that you might do, and expressing that witchcraft is, as Starhawk says, a religion or a practice of poetry and not theology. So it was Woman Most Wild is talking about like how community and rhythm, as in nature's rhythms, and then ritual are sort of the 3 pillars of witchcraft, and that there's different ways you can work with those 3 pillars depending on what you like. And then my second book, The Holy Wild, that was written from a place of sheer rage,
Yes.
where it's, and then it did come out. I wrote it in, when did I write it? I wrote it at the end of 2016. Maybe I have my years a little bit mixed up. I'm not sure. But it did come out like at the time when there was a lot of anger, especially among women.
Yes.
And so it's about these archetypes or characters from the Christian Bible that are traditionally known as like shamed women. So Jezebel or Mary Magdalene.
Yes.
And it's about like looking at their stories as being very much our stories.
Right.
So like even so we're sort of raised to, or if you were raised under Christianity like I was, you're raised thinking that well I'm kind of doomed to be this shamed woman because their stories sound just like my story. And so The Holy Wild is very much a reclamation of these different stories of shamed women, and looking at it through the lens of the 5 elements.
Yes.
And then finally, this my third book, Seasons of Moon and Flame, it is very much about the archetype of the hag, and how our seasonal journey or our yearly journey is sort of a way of working with the hag archetype in terms of story and ritual, magic, writing your own story. And it's looking at each moon, so what I would call a lunar season, so each of the 13 lunar seasons, as relating to one of these stories or tales that the hags in the book tell you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so magical. It's such an incredibly, it was like a visceral experience reading this book. It just took me, I was there. And I love how there's storytelling that goes along with it, as well as here are some rituals that you can do in order to, I guess, is it honor the season that you're in and honor yourself and your natural cycles as you go through the calendar year, would you say?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think, like a lot of rituals and spell work are symbolic actions for working in the liminal space between the witch and the world.
Mm.
So it's a way of kind of bridging those two forces, relative to the season.
Can you talk us through so the archetypes, because there's the maiden and the mother and the crone, and I've heard crone versus hag, and I don't know what the main differences are. Can you talk through what the cycles of the archetypes are?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a big difference between crone and hag, other than crone has maybe become a little bit more palatable than the word hag. I think like the word hag, still a lot of people are like, "Ooh, I don't know about that."
Well, yeah, because it's used in negative context in
Yeah,
our lexicon.
yeah, sure. Um, in Women Who Run with the Wolves, Dr. Estes
Mm.
talks about the wild hag
Yes.
archetype, and so we have Baba Yaga, and then in
Hmm.
Celtic mythology we have the Kalyak, and they are not what we would traditionally think of as beautiful, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they do have, the Kalyak has the blue skin and the red teeth, and so there's something to that repulsion, though, that is kind of like a teacher, like the shadow would be. Like you look at the things that you want to kind of shrink from,
Right.
as like the greatest teachers potentially. So for me, my ideas for Seasons of Moon and Flame, it came from thinking about the hag as as that archetype incarnated in my own grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And so the different stories that are in the book, it was me kind of thinking about the stories that she would tell, which weren't fluffy, like they weren't nice stories necessarily. um but yeah, so this archetypal energy kind of showing up in regular ordinary people, that happens all the time, and it's something that you become more in tune with, I think, the closer you come to your ancestral magic, especially because you
Mm.
start to look at your ancestral stories as showing up in the people in your life. um yeah.
Yeah. Would you say that all of the archetypes, they exist in us at once, and it just depends on what's wanting to come through at the time? Or is it like literally when you become a certain age now you can consider yourself this?
I think that's a good question. I don't know if all of the archetypes exist within us all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But with words like hag or crone or maybe maiden, that seem to be bound to linear time,
Mm-hmm.
if the witch is claiming that they're resistant to linear time, which we usually say that because we're working, when we work our spells, we're sort of weaving memory with vision, and we're looking at manifestation as remembering the future or remembering the
Mm-hmm.
yet to come. So if we're already resistant to linear time, then we can't really be saying like,
Yeah.
well, we have to wait till we're 50 years old to be
Yeah.
able to say we're a hag.
Right.
Or that we can't be a maiden anymore because we're 25 years over 25. I have another epic experience where I went, one of the first big pagan festivals that I went to. I had I guess I had two babies by then, so
Mm-hmm.
I was only 27 though, and or 28, and I wasn't allowed to like walk, I wasn't allowed to weave the maypole. So like we're coming up on Beltane now, and I wasn't
Yeah.
allowed to weave the maypole because now I was a mother, and I wasn't a maiden anymore.
See,
I was
that just doesn't
so
feel right.
upset.
Let me just weave the maypole, people. Why is this so
Right.
difficult? You're disqualified. That's not
I
fair.
was disqualified. Yep. I was all used up.
Oh, that makes me sad. Tell me about Beltane that's coming up. What rituals do you practice during this time?
Yeah, Beltane's such a great holiday for me. So there's lots of witches that think you really don't, like, especially Beltane and Samhain, you really don't work any heavy spells on those days because they're so sacred that you just use them as true holy days where you're just like resting and being, or
Mm-hmm.
in Beltane's case, you're not resting, you're engaging in whatever hedonistic activity you really want to, the feeling flesh and pleasure and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So Beltane is it's usually thought of as like a masculine holiday. So there's a lot of
Hmm.
phallic imagery
Uh-huh.
and fire. But yeah, it's you put glitter on your face and wings or antlers, whatever, and it's this very fantastical pagan experience. So for me, I sort of use the days leading up to Beltane as a time for like really coming into what my big vision is. I call it the big vision. So it's where my witchcraft meets my vision for future generations. So how the values that I hope will undergird the future generations world. undergird my own spells now. So if I'm calling in abundance for myself or something, and abundance is such a weird word anyway, but if I'm calling in abundance or prosperity or healing, whatever it is I'm trying to call in for myself at Beltane, especially, and leading up to summer solstice, I'm asking myself, how do those particular values speak to what I want for not only my children, but even many generations forward? So I'm trying
Yeah.
to forge an intentional bridge between my world and the world of what I might call the future.
Oh, that's really powerful. I've never heard it described that way.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about, values, what you want to leave behind, all of these really, what sounds to me is positive things. Again, going back to how culture sees witchcraft, some of them have this stigma around it, where it's like, oh, it's negative, it's bad. Casting spells is
Mm-hmm.
demonic. All of that kind of negativity.
Mm-hmm.
How does that how are you able to answer someone if they give you that kind of feedback when your intentions are pure, your intentions are positive to want to help going forward? How do you, I mean, it's hard to convince someone if they have their mind made up, but if you can enlighten it's true. I mean, you can just
Yeah.
show up the way you show up in the world. But if somebody were to come up to you and say, well, that's you're negative or bad because this is what you do, and I've always heard what witches do is negative or bad, how would
Mm-hmm.
you respond to that?
If they were open to a little bit of conversation, then I would say, like, where does that belief come from? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why do you think that? And usually it doesn't take very long for them to get under it enough to realize it's an indoctrinated,
Yeah.
an indoctrinated
Mm-hmm.
perception. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, like, what is it exactly that you think I do?
Right. Yeah. Because it's
And
probably not at all what you
it's
think.
probably
Yeah.
not at all exactly. I am not, raising demons in my basement. um and a lot of times it doesn't take long for them to figure out that it's like from childhood, or it's
Mm-hmm.
from a religion that they maybe even don't really buy into anymore. So it's just it usually, if they're open to conversation, it doesn't take very long to dismantle some of those perceptions.
And it could be about anything in life, the left and the right politically, like sitting down and
Mm-hmm.
talking to each other instead of I'm closing my ears, blah, blah, blah. I know I'm
Mm-hmm.
right because of this, but why do you think you're right? What is it that, I mean, it just
Mm-hmm.
takes a little bit of understanding and conversation. And I feel like as this world is shifting out of the COVID, once we get out of this, I think there's so much fertile ground here where we can create something better in our society. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's, so much room for understanding and listening. What do you kind of see from your perspective in terms of what's happening now? As you mentioned, people are having more vivid dreams. They're getting really more connected to their intuition. For me, I'm seeing it as like a worldwide spiritual awakening. The rug has been pulled out, and suddenly people are forced to look inward and listening to
Mm-hmm.
the sounds of their own voice that they haven't been able to before because they've been so caught up in the noise. What do you see during this time are the gifts and the challenges? And then also, what do you see for where we're going after this?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I don't know that I have a concrete answer. Um, but I've been lucky in that a lot of the immersions and retreats and things that I had planned in person, I was able to move them online. So I
Mm-hmm.
really have been in deep conversation with
Yeah.
people for the past few weeks. And it really seems like the common theme, regardless of what the story is. So, like, I have people in my life that they don't know where their next paycheck is coming from, and they're
Yep.
sort of having this moment where it's like their whole world is falling apart. And then I have other people in my life that are working harder than they've ever worked before because they're in healthcare or something.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of what the story looks like, it seems to me like the common theme is that everyone, including myself, is sort of realizing that there were huge parts of their lives that just weren't sustainable before, that like they just needed this moment to step back and look, to be like, oh,
Yes.
what was I doing?
Right.
What was the end game there? Or, like being
Mm.
like kind of critical of the way they had set up their lives during the before times. And now
Mhm.
that we're in these cocoons, it's like really just being uh put right in front of our faces that we were either moving too quickly, or that we weren't happy with that one thing that we thought was a huge part of our work, or that we didn't really know the person that we lived with, like
Right.
all of these different ways that it's manifesting. But it all seems to come down to like clarity. Like people are in
Mm.
this place of just getting some intense clarity right now. And I don't know, I think we're still too in it to be like, what's it going to look like when we
Yeah.
emerge from this? I don't think that we can know. But that does seem to be the common thread, is just like fierce clarity.
Yes, and that fierce clarity also brings up so many old wounds. I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed it in myself, and I've noticed it in people I've spoken to, and it's uncomfortable because we're used to numbing or changing the subject or getting out of the house
Mm-hmm.
and going shopping or finding
Mm-hmm.
different ways to not kind of go deep. And this is a time when we're really being called to go deep. Do you have any, I don't know if it's like a simple ritual or just some advice for people when they come up to that kind of part of their soul that is calling them and is uncomfortable?
Yeah, I do. I think, and this might be because I am a writer, but I do think that anybody can do this. Sometimes, if you don't consider yourself a writer, it's okay to use symbols instead of
Mm.
words, or to draw instead of words. But what I think is good to do seasonally anyway, but especially now, is to go back through your life story. Like go
Mm.
back through the epic novel of your life and see if you can pinpoint a few different chapters, like say between 10 and 20 chapters, regardless of how old you are. And then within those chapters, like what are the moments when you felt you were the most you could possibly be? Like you just had
Mhm.
these moments of like body, mind, and spirit being yoked together in one place, so you weren't scattered, like your body was dancing, but you were thinking about, like, I don't know, your bills or your to-do list or something. It was like just these moments of pure presence. And see if you can really track them. And everyone has them. Sometimes it takes some digging, but everyone has them. And childhood, often, even if the childhood story wasn't good, childhood seems to be a fertile time for these moments of
Mm.
presence. And then what you do after you come up with as many as you can, you look for what the patterns are. So and they're different for everybody. So in the absence of doing these sort of I call them bhava inventories. So
Mhm.
bhava means feeling mind. um in the absence of doing them, you tend to perceive everybody else's moments of bhava as being the same as yours. You're like, everybody must have these same things, and
Right.
everybody's are totally different. So when you look at your own unique patterns, you tend to find elements or parts of nature that you are uniquely drawn to. You tend to find ways of creating, or whatever your unique art is. Some people find that most of their moments are in solitude. Some people find that a lot of them are in community. So it's unique to the person. It's totally unique to the individual. But once you find these patterns of when you were really in the flow of the universe, then you
Mhm.
can start to be a little bit strategic about creating those opportunities for yourself. Because it does point you toward what you really want. And like a lot of times, people that are coming to witchcraft, and when they're talking about manifestation magic, that's this first huge obstacle that they come up against, is like, I don't even know what I want. I don't even know what I want to call in. So this is usually my recommended starting point, is like, just go back through your history and when were you happiest?
That is so
And
powerful.
right. And that's a good place to start with witchcraft too. So if you end up with a lot of moments where, say, you're swimming or there's water involved in some way, then you'll have a lot of water in your witchcraft and your symbolic actions and your rituals. So it points you toward what's yours.
Okay, I am doing that. Everybody at home, you should do that too. I started getting flashes as you were saying this. I'm like, yes, oh yeah, that connects. Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And storytelling, I think when you look at your life as a story, that's really powerful. I like to think of, everybody has their hero's journey, whether they realize it or
Right.
not. You go through the cycles here. So you talk somewhat about storytelling being like a spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm.
How do they connect?
Oh, yes. So many ways. So storytelling. So what I just described, I would maybe call that more like personal myth work. So like trying to find your own epic myth, looking to the myths of your ancestry and seeing like which ones come back for you. So that's a big piece that I think sometimes people miss, and certainly I did. When I was, beginning to do this work, where it's like when we're studying myths, we kind of sit down and we read them and our bodies don't move. And we're like, well, this is interesting, but also weird. And then you just leave it out. But then the myth that's yours is the one that comes back for you. It's the one that something sticks inside, something sticks to your bones when you're reading it that you don't even realize. And then it starts to come back for you in everyday events or in the people in your life. You start to see, the magician or somebody like in your everyday life. So there's that, in that like mythic energy is very much magical and it does move through you, and it wants to move. And so a big part of my witchcraft and storytelling is body prayer, because I learned to write and I learned to cast spells in this very static way where like the body doesn't move and it's kind of this head up experience.
Sure.
When really like embodying the energy through movement is everything. And it makes your spells that much stronger. It makes your stories that much stronger. So if I'm telling a story, I like to invite everyone to move, and it does become like a moving spell. And even if I'm just doing it on my own, it becomes a moving spell. So that's a big piece of it. Words are spells.
Words are spells. And then when you
Yeah.
get the body involved, and then when you get multiple people kind of sharing that energy, it becomes more powerful too.
Exactly.
Well, what is one thing that you'd like to say about the book before we talk about how people can get a hold of you and learn more about your work?
Yeah. One thing that I want to say about the book, just that when you read it, it's about the journey of the reader in visiting these 4 houses of the sacred hags. And so even though it is speaking about the different seasons and rituals that you might do and the cross quarter days and all of that, that it's totally fine if you feel very drawn to a season that you don't happen to be living in at the moment and you want to start there, that's okay. So the book, when you're reading it, I hope that the reader feels it kind of in a liberatory state, and you're free to not read linearly. And
yeah, that makes sense. And of course, you can also follow specifically day by day, or you can go where your heart or your gut, your soul is telling you to go. That's beautiful.
Exactly.
So if people want to get to know you better and learn more about your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. So I'm the founder of the Hag School. So the website is thehagschool.com. So most of my trainings will be on there. I have another website that's just my name, danielledulsky.com. So that's how you would find my books. But I have online covens and apprenticeships. So all of that is on thehagschool.com.
That is wonderful. It has been such a delight chatting with you, Danielle. I've learned so much, and I feel kind of fluttery and excited that I just want to go and read more and learn more. So thank you for using your voice the way you do, because the world needs to hear it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Lighthouse Conversations. If this show resonates with you, it would mean so much to have you rate, review, and share. Don't forget to follow us at chellycanales.com and on social media.